Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we explore how work is transforming one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen. In today's episode, we'll take another look at the competition between people and technology over jobs and wages. We already understand that AI agents and robotics are not just productivity tools, they're essentially non-human labor. Economically, they behave like workers, which means they're competing with human labor on cost, speed, and availability. If we leave this to pure market logic, we're likely to destabilize wages, employment, tax systems, and maybe even political stability. Alternatively, we can choose to actively shape how we build this new economy around abundance and maybe even better work. More of what matters, less of what doesn't, which means we have a decision to make. Do we, as a society and as organizations, intentionally rebalance the system, or do we allow market forces to destabilize and widen inequality and destabilize institutions? My guest today is Rob Garlick, author of AI, Anarchy or Abundance, and visiting professor at the University of Surrey. He spent almost 3 decades at Citigroup, most recently as head of innovation and technology, looking at automation, productivity, labor markets, and the macro implications of technology adoption. Rob, welcome to Future of Less Work.
Delighted to be with you.
You know, I have a master's in economics, and I actually did my master's in economics of technology right before the internet became a thing, right? So this idea that if we go back to the basics of economics, if organizations can create more value with fewer people, why wouldn't they?
Well, the answer is I think they will. I mean, I was a fund manager back in the 90s, and then, as you said, moved to Citigroup almost 30 years ago. So I've really had a front row seat at some sort of capitalism. And the reality is, I think this is the biggest trade in history. The biggest cost of good sold line item is labor. And what these new technologies can do, AI, but also robotics, can be substituting, and it can increase margins exceptionally. And that can be great news for returns, not necessarily good for humans or good for society necessarily. And that's one of the things that I try and explore in the book, because my view is we have to bring enough humans along with us. But actually, we have an economic misalignment because the way that the capitalist system works is that it's very pro-profitability, not necessarily pro-humanity.
So I have an opinion on whether we can replace people with technology, but I'm going to bin that for a second, because a lot of people will argue that we can. And if we can, even if you step in from a pro-human perspective, as businesses, can you survive the market pressure?
Can you survive the market pressure if you just step in with pro-humans and everyone else goes with an automated system? I think it really depends on the market that you're talking about. And again, I'm happy to explore with you, because obviously there are different markets which have different situations. But just take the capital markets, for example. And again, I've lived in this for so many years. The biggest trend in finance in the last 30 years is basically we've been pushing more and more to algorithmic trading, pushing more and more to the machines in terms of passive management, ETFs, quants, etc., making the decisions. So more than 50% of the market is now controlled not by humans, but by machines who are already doing that. And that has downstream implications for everyone else. So just as an example, one of the roles that I did, we had 43 salespeople just doing US equities in London. Now there's basically one. Different version, we had a whole bunch of people doing trading of equities or fixed income. That number's gone down 80% since there. So if your competitors are all doing that, then back to your original question, unfortunately, you can end up being forced, if you want to be a low-cost provider rather than a high-cost service provider, basically to follow that trend.
So if you think of this as if we have a choice, right? Now, I'm not sure. I think the examples you gave, there are a lot of examples where technology replaced people, right? But if you take this very broadly, and you are taking this very broadly, right? Then I go back to, then how can you have a choice to do something different?
Well, okay. So, and there are different choices that we can make. I mean, humans can make a choice where we can go and work with the company that we think looks after people the most. Alternatively, business leaders can make a choice that they decide to be kind of, I don't know, high-end service provider rather than a low-end cost provider. But societies can also make a choice. I mean, just as an example, there were a couple of years ago in Germany, the equivalent of Amazon Go, the automated store, people just walk in and walk out without seeing anybody. They banned it on a Sunday because humans weren't allowed to work on a Sunday. So why should the automated store be allowed to work on a Sunday? So if we decide to, society could say, well, actually, we want, for example, all financial advisors to be people rather than robots or robo-advisors. We want all medical providers to be, licensed and to go through that intermediary. Now, that's a choice because it might be that the robo-advisor might be cheaper, might be better, might be on 24/7. So these are choices that we have to make. But my original premise on the book, which we might get to, is that we're about to go through this enormous, enormous wave of non-human workers that are going to be new competitors, but also providing good new services for people. And there's that balance that we have to kind of work through.
And one of the examples that I think I've read that I really liked was, I think you were alluding to this, right? Unlike the horses displaced by the engine, right? Humans vote. So if the displacement is abundance, as in we can do whatever we like and we have everything we need, right? That's one scenario. But if the displacement is capital markets, right, gain all the value from this, and people don't have money to buy the products, there's going to be issues both for the organizations as well as for the politics side of it.
Yeah, there's already a backlash that's building in different forms, and we can talk about what that might look like. I think, though, that really you only get to those decisions in terms of what society wants when things start breaking. The point on the horses is that people talk about the fact that horses were displaced by tractors and by cars, and the ones that survived got these amazing life of leisure, abundance in fields and everything else, but unfortunately, 88% of them were uneconomic, and they basically were taken to the knacker's yard and put out. So yes, the remaining few, 12%, might have a better lifestyle, but the other people were just not needed. And the difference, again, which you pointed out, is that horses didn't have a say in that. The most important thing that we have to make sure is that the humans have a say in this type of society that we want to try and create, the type of companies that we want to try and create. And my guess is they will get that say. But as I going back to what I said originally, we have a misalignment because at the moment we have an economic system that doesn't allow them to have a say in terms of what actually happens for shareholders. And we have a political society that's democratic and a corporate society that's plutocracy. And so there's a problem brewing there, which we will resolve, but we might not resolve it in a clean way, unfortunately.
So play that out for me, right? How do you see this evolving?
So going back to what I said originally, I think this is potentially one of the biggest trades in history. One of the reasons why all this investment is going in the first stage of this industrial revolution, this cognitive industrial revolution, is very often to do the existing roles cheaper, faster, quicker. In future generations of this, there will be absolutely new revenue streams, new things that we can't even imagine that will come about. But usually industrial revolutions sort of start with the substitution phases of those firstly. Now, this is very similar to what happened in the first industrial revolution. Okay, the first industrial revolution was a substituting industrial technology that went on. And what you found is there were entire generations of people that were basically pushed out of the labor force. And what people talk about as Luddites, and it's very often used as a pejorative term that's sort of like, anti-technology. Well, don't necessarily anti-technology. They were basically just fighting for their survival. Now, the Luddites were 1811. What happened is, over the next 20 years, a series of backlashes that went on, including a revolution in France, which overthrew the monarchy. And eventually in the UK, you got democracy because basically people were given a vote. In 1832, the Reform Act was the first form of democracy in this country, in the UK, where I'm speaking from. But it wasn't given away lightly. The landowners didn't say, well, we just want you to have a vote and it'll all be fine. It came because of enormous amounts of frustration. And I fear that if we have a lot of substitution, then we'll go through similar versions of backlash. So just as an example, you obviously had in 2023, Hollywood striking. So some resemblance to the Luddites and basically saying, pushing back at AI. The big one was actually in 2024 with the longshoremen, the port authorities in the States. They negotiated not just less automation, but negotiated a pay increase of 62%, not 6.2%, 62%. Now, they had a particular amount of power that they could use. They had switched off the US economy because they stopped things coming in the ports. But these are just examples of mini backlashes that start to take place if people feel that it's not equitable. And so how do we manage an equitable transition here is the question I'm trying to ask in the book, because I think it can happen, but I fear that it might not happen.
So actually, let's talk about that, because so I'm going to put my my human resources hat on and some of my agenda, right? So I called this podcast The Future of Less Work because I believe that it needs to go not necessarily down the route of technology will take our jobs, but also that we could be able to do more of what matters and less of what doesn't, right? And you actually in the book call that better work, right? You basically say, okay, we can hand off the work that we do as machines to the machines, and then we can go do other stuff. Historically, and even the revolution, the industrial revolution you talked about, right? I mean, we had technology or machines come into the industry, but then we created things that we didn't have, right? We created clothing for everyone. We created fashion. We created washing machines, right? So that's one way this could go. And that's still through the economic system, not necessarily because people have to negotiate their salary. I mean, I get that in the middle, there's chaos, but do you see a way where the economic system would actually say, the technology opens up possibilities where what we're doing now is not replacing someone, but actually doing things we never could do before, and therefore enable employment in ways that didn't exist?
So on the employment side, yes, it's very possible. You can make jobs up. I mean, the US decided in the 1930s for a work program to make up jobs for millions of people. I mean, Keynes talked about the fact that you could dig holes and then get other people to dig the holes in. So, Germany went through a different phase. It basically conscripted lots of people into the military in the 1930s. So there's lots of ways of making jobs. And actually, back to your podcast, one of the things I think will become an outcome is that I think, like the transition to the weekend that, gave birth to 100 years ago, that we will eventually scale back to kind of 4.5, 4, 3.5, 3 type days. If there's not enough work to go around, then we could be more democratized around that. Now, but I'm not sure that's something society has to vote for. On the point on better jobs, I mean, one of the things I care very deeply about is how do we use this time to reimagine the opportunity to do things better? And it is absolutely very possible to do that. I mean, I ended up doing a master's in behavioral change a few years ago, and to helping coach people, because candidly, I got really frustrated with laying people off, and I wanted to sort of help development and improve them. But what I would say, though, is that the history of several decades of digitization, where that same statement could be made, we automate certain mundane tasks, free people up to do higher value added tasks, etc., has not yet resulted in better work for the majority of people. And there are different surveys. I mean, the one I personally like to use, because I think it's the best one over a longitudinal basis, is the Gallup study. And in the Gallup study, only 20% of people are positively engaged at work. Yes. More people are actively not engaged or disengaged. And so the data suggests that's not true. And what we know is true is that rather than, and again, I've unfortunately had to do this, rather than, okay, well, we just freed up 20% of your time for you to have more leisure, go to the gym, see your kids, whatever else it might be, do higher value tasks. What happens is we then get rid of 20% of the people, and the rest of the people have to do more work. And so this overwhelm that's been going on because of the pace of change, but also the intensification of jobs, means that that's not the reality. Now, we absolutely can change that, but whether we change it because the economic system allows us to change it, or whether we change it because society gets to change it, they're two different debates.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you. Here's a different perspective, though. I don't think it's about jobs. I think part of the big question is because you described when I do kind of my keynote on scenarios, right? I call that the $1 billion company with no people, right? It's like let's like you said, get rid of 23% if we've improved 23%, right? There's also the scenario where you have the $1 billion person with no company, which is different than where we were in the past, because suddenly a person has access to capabilities, tools, and technology that wasn't the case when you had, the Industrial Revolution or even the Internet Revolution, not at the same scale. And so the interesting question is, we keep referring to work as jobs. And I think I saw a LinkedIn map recently that showed that younger generations are now more active in starting up their own innovative companies or entities. I don't know what to call them, right? We don't have the right words around that independent economy. But that might actually be an interesting way to get better work, because you design your own work. You're doing what matters to you. You have the tools at your disposal, and it might actually economically make sense.
Yes, and I think that you're right, and I think that's the direction of travel. But one of the things, even if you don't believe there'll be joblessness, you said it yourself, you used the word chaos, the transition process into that from what we have existing today could be quite difficult for quite a lot of people. And so how do we put the safety nets in place for something? So just as an example, I mean, again, in the book, what I try to do is the first section is really looking at the problems. Majority is looking for solutions. And I've tried to surface over 130 different solutions to this to make sure because we have lots of options, which is great. And I'm really keen on finding solutions that are working somewhere that could be transported. So flex security in Denmark and the Nordic countries is a way where they allow people to give themselves the scope to be able to retrain and retool for new opportunities. And I think what you're talking about there from a sort of, portfolio career or different I don't say side hustles, that sounds wrong, but different opportunities as people are transitioning. I think absolutely society should try and give them the support for that. But what I will say again, I mean, there's a recent study, I think it was by Goldman Sachs, that 46% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have the scope to be able to go necessarily do this. And I think a lot of self-employment, candidly, is that people still want to keep that optionality, but actually a lot of it is people living on the edge, not living in a kind of a vast abundance. So
yeah, and it's really interesting because you and I are not talking in the US right now, and many of my listeners are, and the whole idea of safety nets built around employers versus around national infrastructure, right? So if you go back to the countries where there's national infrastructure for healthcare and kind of like schools, right? And we all get to go to school regardless of, or like basic education, right? Regardless of what your parents are doing as kids. But we don't extend it to, for example, healthcare, or some countries extend it to higher education and others don't. Some countries have started extending it to training, retraining, this whole, ability to kind of stay relevant during your life cycle, even pension, right? Is it yours? Does it move with you regardless of where you work or how you work? If you thought of safety nets that way, where we create the abundance, and it could be taxing AI or, something like that, but basically create the ability to pay for this at a national level, maybe people won't care anymore if they get a job as an employer or they participate in the independent economy.
Yes, I largely agree with that. I mean, when you say if, I mean, obviously the school education system was born out of the Industrial Revolution, actually to try and get people into be more efficient in factories. But I find it remarkable. I mean, when I'm not pretending it's right, but the fact that in the UK, the National Health Service was sort of born out of kind of the war period that we had, where Bevin said, it's surely a mark of a civilized society that we provide healthcare for people. And here we are 100 years later, or say not quite, but, kind of like still in some countries where healthcare is not there. And it's actually tied to employment. So not only is your job really critical because for lots of different reasons, but it's also critical because if you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. And so these are the type of safety nets that are there. But I will say it's bigger than that. And I know some of the work that you've done sort of this hopefully will resonate, which is, I think things like universal basic income as a safety net, for example, that puts that cushion on board. A, I don't think we could afford it. But B, I don't think that's what people want. They don't want to be put on benefits and have to sort of like, just hope that something. What they want is actually to be able to contribute, do meaningful, important work that's going to help provide for, contribute to people in society and to others, etc. So I think that we can redesign work, and safety nets is part of it, but also let's not take away work from a whole bunch of people. Let's give them opportunity to do really meaningful, important things. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's why I kind of liked your concept of horses didn't vote. People do, because ultimately the safety nets are required so that people aren't necessarily dependent on the gatekeepers to give them work versus go out and do something wonderful, because you have the tools and you've got the, the education, and maybe the backlash, the social backlash and the chaos in the middle will force governments to figure out the way to actually design those safety nets. It's kind of my hope.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I hope in the book, that people, if they can at least see the options, they can decide what they want to do about it. But that includes, voting or socializing the topic with other people to discuss these things. And, I think if there was, when I surface 100 and plus 30 plus different options, I then tried to put them in a framework. And you just mentioned kind of better jobs being one, enough, you can't have a better job if you don't have a job, so enough jobs. But probably the most important of those 5 factors in the best framework is this idea of say. How do we give people say? And you mentioned it, and I know you were a very successful career in a number of areas of HR. But one of the things, I was talking to some board members the other day in an event. And in one of the pieces of data that I have, 99% of boards have an ex-CFO on them. Only 2% have an ex-head of HR on them. So if we care about the money a lot more than we care about the people, how do we make sure that the people have got enough say in this process? That's one of the things that I think, again, is this potential misalignment and potential thing we need to try and solve for.
Yeah, and from your framework, and you have the best framework, right? So the better work, the enough opportunity, you have the say in outcomes, and I was actually, and we talk about the safety nets, and the system shifts, but I paused on the say because I was wondering, does it circle back to we need to have unions, right? Like you mentioned the examples, because the economic system, right? Will they slow something down because of somebody wanting to think about the people, even if you had an HR on the board? Or does it really require that national level?
I think it's a good question. Obviously, all companies are different. One of the things that's happening at the moment, which could be a self-correcting mechanism, to be honest with you, is there's a lot of experimentation, POCs, now implementation of AI. And AI tools. And that's only going to go more and more as you kind of go into agents and you go into moving robots, etc. But one of the things I think a lot of companies are finding is that they're putting this technology in and it's not being adopted at the pace and the scale that they wanted to. So I've actually had quite a lot of people come to me and say, how do we speed up adoption? And you'll know if you decompose change management, which unfortunately hasn't got a good history of success, but the biggest limiter, the biggest bottlenecks happen to be people and process. And the people aspect of it, it might be that actually companies have a sort of more symbiotic relationship with their staff to make sure that the tools are being used and adopted and everything else. Now, clearly it's different this time because there is a fear that as you adopt those tools, that you're training something, say an agent, that might take over, what you were doing before. And I would also say, in those safety nets, one of the things that we talk about is this idea of reskilling. Everyone says that reskilling and upskilling is sort of part of the solution. And absolutely, of course it is. But the history in the last 2 decades has been that companies haven't been putting in that. I mean, I was at an event yesterday, and one of the people from the TUC who was speaking on a panel said that in the UK, learning and development by companies is down by half in the last decade. Now, I'm not sure that's her number, not mine, but the point is that you could argue that this reskilling and upskilling that will happen will be even more for the non-human workers than the human workers. That's where the budget could go to. So
yeah, because you're also saying reskilling and upskilling to what, right? I mean, that's part of what we don't understand when you hand over, and I've written extensively a lot of Forbes articles on this. AI implementation is not about the technology; it's about the people, and it's not because of the social, aspect of it, but just purely it's the people that are not changing the way that we would allow for the potential to actually show up. And it's interesting because I'm not sure change management, definitely not the way we used to think about it, is the solution. But part of it is, what is the human role? What are the nuances of the human skills and capabilities that we've kind of built into the way we did things that we didn't even notice were there? Now, when you're automating things, they're falling, and nobody's picking them up because we didn't even know they existed.
Do you think the humans will become more valuable in that process, in this process, or the humans become less?
I don't know that I would think about it this way, but what I am very sure is that there are nuances of human value add into the processes. Because ultimately AI tools are AI tools, right? So if your company and my company and our competitors and our suppliers and our customers all have access to the same AI, what makes us different? What makes us unique? Today, we're still building on, who we were and the people we used to have in our culture and the way we did things. But if you speed this up and ultimately you bring in people who deploy tools and have never had the history, I think I call it a white t-shirt. We'll all end up making a white t-shirt, and then somebody will figure out to make a pink one, and we'll all look at them and say, wow, how'd you do that, right? And that would be adding that value back in. So I actually think the people, my version of the economy will not let this happen is not the social version. It's that the organizations that will replace people with tools are going to lose their edge. They're going to lose what makes them unique. It will take a while before that disappears. But if you think about things like you're building a PowerPoint presentation, and I know after the session, right, you have a presentation. The PowerPoint presentation is not about colorful, letters on a screen. It's about building a story. And when you ask the tools to build the story for you, they're not quite doing it the way you have it in your head. And sometimes you wouldn't even know how to tell them the story you want until you go through the process, right? So there's all these little things that we do as we go through our activities that I think we're going to learn to turn into the real work.
And everything you said makes sense there. I really desperately hope that the human value, all those little nuances that you're talking about, become recognized and valued. I think there's a couple of different issues that I wrestle with this. One is that if we start pushing people out, say knowledge economy, but I mean, this is a blue collar revolution as well. But if we start pushing people out of jobs, what you're going to have is you're going to have a surplus of people coming into those roles where everyone's competing for that. It's a bit like the overpopulation of graduates that we have at the moment. 42% of graduates are underemployed. So I worry a little bit that, but more importantly, and this is a question, but how do we make sure we value those human roles? And so, because in quite a lot of the areas where humans are very valuable, I mean, my in-laws are in a nursing home, for example, but there are other examples. My son's a trainee doctor, but we don't actually value those roles particularly well historically. Yeah. And I was co-presenting actually last week with a gentleman who's from Japan, and I was really intrigued by the fact that he was saying to me, and I don't know this firsthand, but that, for example, the people who are the garbage people in Japan put on uniforms and take a lot of pride in their jobs. How does society revalue some of these innately human qualities and skills and jobs and everything else that's there? rather than this, what's happened in society is we've had basically a valuation going to fewer and fewer people. And you use the example of the company that can be, I don't know, $1 billion company, a unicorn company with very few people. Unfortunately, we're getting more of that and not more of people valuing in society some of these human roles. And so anyway, we'll get there, but I think it might be a transition.
I agree. And I agree. And I think part of the way we will get there circles back to we'll get there through the individuals creating value that's based on what they know how to do and are now able to do versus organizations opening the door to these human roles. But, it's definitely very interesting times. Rob, just as we wrap up, I'm curious, what do you think is the question we should all be asking ourselves about the future of work?
Well, I think it's relatively simple. And I deliberately try to make it simple in the book. The question's simple. The answer's more tricky. We have the technology is even more progressive, I think, than many people realize. So we have a very pro-machine technology. We have an economic system that is pro-profitability since 1970, Milton Friedman's, shareholder essay, primacy essay. How do we make sure we are also pro-human enough in this next phase of AI? So it's a balance between pro-machine, pro-profitability, and pro-human. And that's easy to say, and I try and talk about that in the book about different ways of getting to that, because we actually kind of know some of the answers. If you wanted to sort of like a second question to that is, how do we get more alignment between that? Because as I said, we have a democratic society, but a plutocratic economy based on incentives that are driving towards shareholders, my old world that I know, and I'm not sure the two meet naturally. So I'd love us to find out how that works. And there are different solutions, but that's the thing that I'm really wrestling with.
So if we have a leader or CEO listening to us now, thinking, okay, I can't take care of big social problems, but and given my board and my expectations, what's the one thing I can do?
Well, I think that if we drive to also make sure that we have pro-human outcomes, and one measure of that, for example, is this positive engagement. How do we reimagine work so that it is better work for enough people? That is where I would go. And actually, what I mentioned about presenting with this Japanese gentleman the other day, the company that brought us in is already really, really pro-human. I mean, they brought us in not because they have a problem, but because they just want to be better at it. So this is something that won't happen necessarily all in one go across society. There'll be different CEOs that kind of now. The one person criticized my book, and I appreciate. He's a wise man, and I appreciate it. He said that this is not just going to come from enlightened leadership. He said you can't just ask leaders to suddenly just go, because most leaders, they're good human beings. They want the most for their work. What has happened though is that 1965 the average CEO pay to worker pay was 20 to 1. Now it's 400 to 1 in the States. What's happened is that the system has skewed it. So if the capitalist system says, Mr. CEO who wants to do all the right thing for the humans, but actually you're not doing right for the shareholders, they basically move them on. So that's where the tension is. But I hope that we will get some leaders who find the right balance between those two things. And we have to get the right balance because otherwise the system, a bit like that Luddite thing I talked about earlier on, and I hope we don't get there, but it will force change to get there. And better to go there in a straight line rather than down and up.
Yeah, somewhere in the system. Wow, Rob, that was really interesting. Thank you for joining me today. For more about Rob Garlick and his new book, AI, Anarchy, or Abundance, check out the links in the podcast description. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow us wherever you take your podcasts. And remember, your best people do not work because they have to. They do not work because you tell them to. They do not work because you measure them on it. They work because they want to. Because by working for you, they're doing what's important to them in life. Till next time.